Welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm Cohen, the Chief Research Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And not joining me today is our usual host, Brian Phillips. However, sometimes here on The Right Idea, we like to slow things down and really discuss the policies that underlie some of the decisions that are being made here at the state. And today's one of those days. And joining me here is Dr. Matt Logan, Associate Professor at Texas State University. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks for having me, DC. I appreciate it.
So before we begin, obviously we're going to get into the weeds. We're going to get pretty technical, but I want to give the audience a little bit of understanding of your background. So tell us a little bit about how you essentially arrived down in San Marcos.
Yeah, sure. I've been there for the past 5 years now in the School of Criminal Justice and Criminology, and it was an opportunity that presented itself back when I was an assistant professor at Cal State San Bernardino, where I was for 5 years. But we've been here now for a good little bit, and I'm a corrections scholar at heart, and so I've always been fundamentally interested in what happens inside of prisons and also the policies that inform decision making within prisons, and then things related to what happens when people get outside, whether or not it's rehabilitative programming, whether it's some form of informal sanctioning. That stuff has always driven my interest research-wise. So I'm happy to talk about some of that stuff today. And
I'd be remiss not to mention your involvement with veterans as a population of special interest.
Yeah, really interested, generally speaking, in the sociodemographics of prison adjustment, but veterans have become a pet project of mine over the last 7-8 years. Had a chance to work with a lot of great people, so definitely a population that I care deeply about.
Excellent. And so obviously the reason that we're here today is to discuss this paper that you have coming out with our friend and colleague, Dr. John Wright of Cincinnati. I should also mention that we're both Cincinnati alums ourselves.
We are.
But I do want to mention the paper that you have coming out. And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the title is An Unblinkered Approach to Criminal Rehabilitation, or at least that's a working title.
That's the working title. We're going to have to talk to some of the folks over at MI and see what the final title will be, but that was what we had submitted to them, and those were some of the suggestions that they made, so I think we're going to go with that.
I was about to say nowadays, and I would say as somebody with students, that most people just plug things into a Chat GPT and see what it pops out.
It's pretty useful.
Yeah, I would say kids these days, though, right?
Sure.
But so you mentioned MI, so obviously the paper that we want to talk about, the Unblinkered Approach to Criminal Rehabilitation, is a forthcoming policy brief from the Manhattan Institute, or should I say published by the Manhattan Institute. And obviously, we know folks over there. We've been on panels before with Ralph Mangwall.
Yep.
So obviously they do some great work over there as well. But I'm curious as to this particular paper, because this is an interesting turn for Manhattan, not insofar that it's an area that they never ran in before, not at all, or that it's a philosophical orientation they didn't seem to possess. But this is one of those, I think, policy analyses that really just pushes back against some of what we would consider received wisdom that we have in our field right now, in the field of criminology, specifically within rehabilitation. And obviously there always needs to be somebody to say that the emperor is naked, right? And so that's really what I want to bring in. So let's just talk right now about, give us and I try not to put words in your mouth, but also set the table here. Give us like the 30,000-foot view of what this paper is and what it talks about.
Sure. Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. You say that the emperor's wearing no clothes. I think it was sort of an honest appraisal, a necessary pushback against what we think we know about the efficacy of correctional rehabilitation, specifically as a criminal justice policy. So it takes a deep dive into sort of the ideological underpinnings of correctional rehabilitation historically. We also discuss at length, the people who were in charge of administering those programs and some of the potential conflicts of interest that they might have in terms of, being paid financially to conduct those evaluations. We also talk about, just generally speaking, how a lot of the correctional rehabilitation literature is at odds with a lot of the stuff that we know about the offending population, specifically life course criminology, the stability of antisocial behavior, the intractability of certain groups, very small cadre of offenders, but but how difficult it really is to change behaviors and how politically unsavory that might be with respect to folks who, I should note, really do have an earnest desire to improve the lives of folks. I think our argument, generally speaking, is that this sort of stuff has been overpromised and overmoralized to the detriment of a lot of the people that are trying to be helped.
Excellent. And I think that's a great framing, because each one of those, I would say, table legs you put under there is something that I want to address as we progress here. Sure. So I guess, not a lot of people, I would guess that not many listeners to this particular show really have the Bentham through Martinson through Cohen view of, criminological rehabilitation. They didn't have to read all that as we did.
Sure.
So I want to kind of give a broad perspective, kind of going back, I would say probably starting in, the divergence during the progressive era. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about how criminological rehabilitation really became ascendant and some of the course corrections, or some of the reroutings it has taken along the way.
It's interesting. It just depends on, whom you talk to. But, a lot of folks would think, just looking back historically, that the United States has been like overtly punitive when it comes to how it handles its offender populations. Fact of the matter is that for a very, very long time, the United States has embraced a rehabilitative, almost a medical model towards dealing with offenders. So, you can go all the way back to the 1870s and the Cincinnati Congress and the giant penal reform movement that sprung from that. But really for the most of, let's just say, the 20th century, we embraced a medical model. It was based on the idea that offending was an affliction, that people were sick, and that they needed to be treated.
Their humors were unbalanced.
Yes, so to speak, right? And the idea was that the only way that they could be reformed was through, the penitentiary system, that, they would do their time, they would reflect, and it was only then, after they showed that they could repent for their sins, so to speak, hence the name penitentiary, but that they were able to sort of re-enter society. There was sort of an indeterminate component of that, right? Mm-hmm. That you're reformed when we say you're reformed. And the difference, I think, we highlight this in the paper, the difference between reformers of the past versus reformers of today is reformers of the past were infatuated with institutions. Again, offenders were treated as sick. They had some sort of malady that could only be treated under the supervision of professionals and separated from society. This is much different from the reformers of today. In fact, we make an argument, and we can touch on it at some point, that I think a lot of modern day reformers, that rehabilitation is used as a Trojan horse for other extreme policies like abolition and outright abolition. So I think when you look at the model, right, let's just stick within the 20th century up till now. But we had this medical model going right up until the tail end of the civil rights movement, right? You had a lot of unrest, a lot of distrust in institutions. For our part, on the academic side of things, there were a lot of studies that were coming out that was sort of questioning the legitimacy of people's ability to supervise and manage populations. You had, the work of sociologists like Irving Goffman's stuff on asylums. You had David Rosenhan's on being sane in insane places. You had Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiments, all that stuff that was drawing a lot of attention and the ire of people with respect to these institutions. About the same time, though, as you had crime rates that were slowly climbing, and they reached a crescendo, right, in the 70s and 80s when violent crime just went right through the roof. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And at that time, you also had some people who were a little bit skeptical of the medical model, namely Robert Martinson, who famously did not say actually that nothing works. Mm-hmm. He said some things work some of the time for some populations. But that became, dare I say, bastardized, and he became sort of the penultimate villain for progressives. And so they sort of rallied against, that notion, and they were really determined to say, here's what works and here's what doesn't. But before they got to that part, right, you had sort of this bipartisan agreement that the medical model and rehabilitation was sort of dead.
So what was the because you mentioned the nothing works, again, asterisk view on the right. What was the beef on the left?
They were primarily concerned with judicial discretion, but from the other side of things, they, again, tail end of the civil rights movement. The short of it is that they believed particularly that judges and other criminal justice officials would use their discretion to further disparities that were already observed in the system. And so it was this weird kind of coming to Christ moment, so to speak, where you had the left and the right kind of joined forces. And it ultimately resulted in the introduction of federal sentencing guidelines. What came about of it was sort of this just wholesale discounting of the rehabilitative model, where, on the right, you had folks say that judges were being too lenient, that they were giving folks slaps on the wrist, right? And then on the left, again, a lot of distrust and saying, well, you're using your discretion to further these disparities. And so introduce federal sentencing guidelines, bring in sort of Robert Martinson's work on correctional rehabilitation, and then also pepper in exploding crime rates. And he sort of had this recipe for people to say, you know what, rehab is dead.
Rehab is dead because it's either too hard or too soft on crime, depending on where you stand.
Yeah. And that went on for better part of 2.5 decades, right? And we used, for example, incarceration as a policy lever. We pulled it quite hard, and we incarcerated quite heavily. And, as you're well aware, in the mid-'90s, late '90s, crime started to really drop off. And, Barry Latzer, who's a criminologist over at John Jay, he talks about this in his book, The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime in America. He says, when you do these certain things, you pull certain levers, they don't necessarily take hold right away. You see sort of a lagged effect. So for a while in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, we incarcerated a lot. 5-10 years after the fact, we started to see crime rates taper off and go down. It was at that point that progressives started pointing to, well, look, now we have these robust prison populations, but crime rates are down. Maybe we take our foot off the gas. Maybe we start reinvesting, reaffirming rehabilitation. And where you and I went, the University of Cincinnati, that was sort of ground zero for developing evidence-based approaches as to whether or not rehabilitation worked and under what circumstances. And so it was really, I'd say, late 90s, early 2000s, you started to see sort of this reinvestment in rehabilitation.
Yeah, and I think that sets the table well, because I think that it's important for folks to understand that rehabilitation, as a practice is just, obviously this is the most, CJ 101. I don't know if you ever got caught having to teach that at 8 a.m. on a Monday.
I have.
I think they give that to everyone's first time through.
They do. It's the trial by fire.
Yeah, exactly. But rehabilitation is but one of 4 to 5, depending on how you slice it. Purposes of our actual criminal justice system, right? Obviously, retribution. Being able to demonstrate the moral opprobrium that that somebody's act was socially intolerable is one.
I think that is also one of the most fundamentally misunderstood concepts.
Oh,
because the way that a lot of academics portray retribution is, you hear eye for an eye, you hear tooth for a tooth, you hear the Code of Hammurabi referenced, you hear sort of this like vengeance-based non-utilitarian approach. I would argue that retribution is predicated on the notion of fairness. It's what undergirds the system. And without it, you don't have a system, because if I do something and it causes harm to somebody else and the justice system doesn't punish me, right? And you can think about a number of cases where, too lenient a sentence has been doled out and folks have been enraged. It's because retribution, proportionality, and punishment was not perceived to have been met. And if you don't have that, it's like what separates us from engaging or enacting vigilante justice. It's the idea that the state will act on our behalf to dole out the necessary punishment. So people look at retribution as sort of this non-utilitarian approach that it doesn't benefit folks.
Right.
It really does. It's symbolic in its value that if you don't take action, what's to stop me, or why shouldn't I? It has a really, really important value. I would argue that it's probably the most important.
You're absolutely right, and I didn't want to. When I said retribution, I wasn't trying to cheapen it, because I mean we got taught it the exact same way, but obviously that is a core function of the system, because we designed we literally designed the philosophy of punishment around it,
Right.
which I think your observations both on it being I'd say probably. I don't want to say it's misunderstood, because I think everyone innately understands it. I think it has to be misframed and mistaught. They have that. You obviously have deterrence. You're going to punish so that somebody else looks at that and goes, "Ooh, I don't want any of that," or, specifically that they feel the pain of that. You have that. Then you have rehabilitation, which obviously is you want to get the people not to offend again. Which obviously you mentioned it's a very, very admirable goal, and that's where folks have kind of been, I would say, kind of stuck in the mud, because as your paper discusses, there really hasn't been a whole lot of. You'd figure that if we're like, let's translate back to the medical model. If we are trying to find a panacea, or even better yet, a control medication for an illness that is crime, or when you look at it like criminologists like us do, like innate criminality.
Yep.
If you're looking at that, like. Compare it to like high blood pressure. After a while, people have discovered statins, and are able to regulate that, or is that cholesterol? I can't remember, whichever one. But they're able to regulate these particular things with a particular type of medicine. The problem, of course, though, is that there is no one type of rehabilitation. And we see stuff that are incredibly, I would say, scientifically thorough. Your DBTs, your CBTs, and then we see stuff that has. We'll get it. Oh, don't worry, we'll get into it. But then you also see stuff where it's like acupuncture, dog therapy. Let them brush horses and they become less criminals. What was it that the late great Dr. Latessa always used to say? If you gave somebody who's fundamentally antisocial and fundamentally has these criminogenic risk factors a job, you're just going to have an employed criminal.
Yep.
Or if you give them self-esteem therapy, you're going to have a criminal that feels really good about their odds, which is
He used to say that about boot camps too. Is like you put people in the best shape of their lives who are extremely antisocial, right?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a great thing. It's interesting, and you're talking about rehab, and one of the things that we get at in the paper is that depending on whom you ask, you could ask 20 different people what rehabilitation looks like, and you're probably going to get 20 different responses. And it's really important to note that within academia, we have a very narrow view of rehabilitation in terms of program success, right?
Well, so that was so when I mentioned, you chuckled when I mentioned CBT and DBT. A lot of those are the kind of the operational lodestones of criminologic rehabilitation. But from what I want to understand reading your paper, you're saying that that's one of the problems, that even though we structure, and I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole without setting definitions here, but the way we structure it, you mentioned R&R earlier. Let us describe R&R and kind of how rehabilitation plugs into that, or to your assessment does not.
The whole idea of correctional rehabilitation is that we can properly calibrate treatments based on one's needs and risks through a variety of what would be considered effective treatments. So risk is simply the idea that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, that high-risk folks get treatment that is designed for high-risk individuals, right? And that pertains to things like dosage, right? So a good medical analogy is that if you had, stage 4 cancer, you probably want to have some pretty intensive chemotherapy, right? And you get this really, really aggressive type of treatment. It wouldn't make sense, for example, to give that same type of treatment to somebody who has stage 0 or stage 1 cancer, right? Because you could actually be doing more harm than good. So the idea that we properly calibrate individuals, that we classify individuals as to whether they're low, medium, high risk, that's a fundamental component. And I will give the rehabilitation folks their due credit. I think rehabilitation has done a great deal of good in terms of properly classifying individuals. I'm skeptical as to whether or not upon classification, those folks can actually change these deep-seated behaviors. But classification for security purposes is really important. We have a variety of risk assessments that can do that. But risk is really all about calibrating. Then you have need, right? It's this idea that the folks get involved in the criminal justice system because they have a variety of sort of criminogenic needs that need to be addressed. The rehab folks tend to fundamentally focus on antisocial behaviors, so having antisocial peers, having antisocial personality disorders, and a litany of other things. You have the big four, the central eight, right? And that's something that we would, if you were ever in a corrections class with me, that I would cover. But a variety of sort of individual characteristics, both sort of static and dynamic factors. And rehabilitation is really big on targeting. Maybe I should give a definition as to what static and dynamic factors are. But static factors are
let's presume that the listeners have not sat through either one of our classes.
Sure. Well, static factors are things that are risk factors, right? That, would make it likely or more likely that you might get involved in the criminal justice system, but are things that you can't change. So having, for example, a parent who went to prison, right? That's a static risk factor. It matters in terms of our prediction as to whether or not you're going to end up, say, in prison, but it's not something we can necessarily do about it. It's the same thing with criminal history. If you've committed, 35, 45, different offenses in the past, I can't necessarily do anything about that in particular. Can't change that. Same thing with age and a litany of other things. Dynamic factors, on the other hand, you can kind of see as more fluid, right? Susceptible to change, or amicable to change, rather. And, the idea here is that if you can target those things, you can have a more meaningful impact on folks when it comes to actually trying to change these behaviors. Antisocial personality disorder is probably the primary one. And that's where you see folks really lean into cognitive behavioral therapy, which is sort of the third part of the R&R model. There's risk, there's need, there's responsivity. And the folks in the rehab camps have really been heavily influenced by a brand of Canadian psychology, Canadian psychologists who have, done a lot of stuff with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is heavily rooted in social learning theories, predicated on both positive and negative reinforcement.
I mean, they call them in our classes, they call them the Canadians, the Paul Gendreaux and whatnot.
That's right. Gendreaux, Bonta, Andrews, right? Paula Smith over at University of Cincinnati. She's part of that lineage. And one of the things with responsivity is that, like, if you tailor certain treatments to certain learning styles, things like cognitive behavioral therapy will be effective when it comes to reducing recidivism.
You're finding the right plug for the outlet,
so to speak. Yeah. And CBT is based on a lot of sort of role playing and correcting thought-based errors, right? Or thinking errors, rather. So the things that kind of got those folks into trouble in the first place. It's really aimed at correcting thinking distortions, antisocial thinking distortions. And our question within the paper is, how effective really is that kind of stuff?
And so let us kind of start exploring that, because I think that you essentially have. I don't want to short shrift your paper, but if we group them all into a three-ring circus, which anyone who studied criminology professionally, I think would appreciate the metaphor. You essentially point out insufficient academic support to launch the campaigns that have been launched in service of these particular models in this particular approach. You say that there are ideological and political influences, both internally and externally, that drive a lot of the appetite for and decision making in this particular process. And three, that there is essentially and again, I want to flag that these are my words and not yours or co-author John Wright, is that there is a rehabilitative cartel. And this is what you mentioned earlier when you said, that there are folks who got a little bit of the fox watching the hen house here, and people with conflict of interest that may establish themselves as those who would advance this practice. Is that a fair, I would say, categorization of your paper?
Yes, and yes.
So let's take it apart piece by piece, or dive in piece by piece, I should say. Insufficient academic support.
Well, this goes back to the idea that the emperor really is wearing no clothes. And if you do a little bit of a deep dive of a lot of the individual studies of rehabilitation, you find that they are, in terms of methodological rigor, highly questionable. In an ideal world, if you were undertaking some sort of research project where you wanted to figure out whether, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy worked or any other sort of rehabilitative modality, you would have sort of a classic, I'm giving sort of a watered down version of this, where I'm going to describe what's called a randomized control study, but you would have a treatment group, so the group that gets rehabilitation, and you would have a control group. So similarly matched on a variety of characteristics, age, race, gender, sociodemographics, kind of aside, but you would want to make sure that those groups are similar to one another, right? So one group gets rehabilitative treatment, the other group doesn't, right? In a classic scenario, you'd follow up with them and then make different points of comparison at different points in time, and you would expect, for example, that the group who received the treatment would, on average, have lower rates of recidivism, right? That rarely happens. Right.
You're saying we can't sentence somebody to a control group, is what you're saying.
Well, the social world is not a controlled laboratory experiment, to be fair. The social world is messy, right? But in order to parse out causality and what cause and effect, to figure out whether or not the programming that you're offering is working, that is one tool. It has been done, by the way. And we talk about in that paper some of the studies that have, or excuse me, some of the meta-analyses that have looked at randomized control studies and whether or not they find an effect for rehabilitation. The answer, in short, is no, not really. But going back to RCTs, that's the gold standard. That's what you would hope to do, however difficult it might be. The vast majority of those studies are either quasi-experimental, which you see a lot of that in criminal justice research anyway.
Oh, absolutely.
Fair enough. But a huge amount of them are correlational or observational, which means there isn't even a matched group or a control group. In fact, when you and for the listeners who aren't familiar, the average reduction in recidivism that is reported in the rehabilitation literature is 10%. You might say, well, how do you come to that number, right?
Just for their understanding, the assertion that a 10% reduction in recidivism is significant.
Yes, that it is significant statistically. Practically, it's not. It really isn't. And there are a number of reasons for it. But when you actually take a look at, first of all, what 10% translates into, you got to understand a little bit about how effect sizes are calculated. And so when we do a study of rehabilitation, right, did this group offend less than the other group, the rehab group versus the control group? If yes, then you get an effect size where you see a reduction in recidivism. Do that 100 times, right? Do that study over 100 times, take each individual effect, average it, and that's what's called a meta-analysis, where you take sort of the average effect of all of the different studies. Kind of works like a batting average, right? Where you can kind of get an idea as to whether certain programs evaluated in different circumstances have an appreciable effect on recidivism. The problem is that for a large majority of those studies, there isn't even a treatment versus control group that's being done. You have a hypothetical probability of recidivism that's calculated. And so
it's like that study, I can't remember what it was, but about 3 years ago, it was everybody in the political circles were making fun of it because they basically created this non-existent counterfactual. They called it synthetic Connecticut, I remember. But it's essentially the same thing. It's like you are creating what is essential. It's like the same reason that we talk about, median versus average, because you can get something in the mean and the average that does not exist within the population because it's a function of how it's calculated. Similarly, this sounds like the benchmark, or what stands in the proxy of a control group, is essentially a made up number.
It's a recidivism rate that's assumed to be 50%. And so what you can have is these high fidelity, high dosage, really well-constructed programs where the vast majority or nearly half of them fail, and it can still look like a success because it's compared to this. I don't want to say synthetic because statistically that's not what I'm getting at, but it is an assumed probability of a recidivism rate of 50%. So let's say my treatment group, let's say 45% of them fail, right? And I compare that to the 50% recidivism as calculated by this assumed probability. That 5% differential corresponds with a 10% reduction in recidivism. The difference between 45 and 50%. And rehab folks will take that and say, look, 10% reduction in recidivism. And then if you actually look at the probability distribution of how all these studies and their averages are plotted out, if you're saying that it's a 10% reduction in recidivism, you're only looking at one side of the distribution, right? You're not looking at the other side of the distribution of scores where you document iatrogenic negative effects. Iatrogenic is a fancy word for harmful, right? Programs that actually increase the likelihood of recidivism. So that side of the distribution is sort of conveniently ignored.
Just lump it all in with the does not work.
Well, and then statistically, you have to ask again, like what's the policy relevance of a 10% reduction in recidivism, considering you have, in many ways, you have studies that are being conducted with different populations, different parts of the country, different resources, fairly different definitions of recidivism. A lot of them are simply just binary coded, like did you come into contact or not, sort of thing. Did you get rearrested or not? They have different definitions. So when you were talking about rehabilitation, I sort of laughed. I was going to ask, like, how do you define rehabilitation? Like, what to you, if somebody who said I'm reformed, I'm rehabilitated, what would that look like?
I guarantee nobody who says they're rehabilitated goes, I was not convicted within a 3-year time horizon, or something incredibly scientific and nerdy.
And that's sort of the thing too, is so when you're looking at sort of the policy relevance from a statistical point of view, and for my stats-minded friends, I would ask, well, is that just noise statistically?
So I think that definitely establishes the part of your argument where you say it is unsupported, or at the best tangentially supported with a very large asterisk. That's my categorization, not yours. But I want to talk about that if we have this house of cards, this shaky foundation, if we have this, what's keeping us from, maybe not even reversing course, but going back and trying to retool some of the perspectives that we have on this? What's the, kind of the ideological and political influence that basically keeps, to use their word, not ours, but to keep progress from this particular thing?
To preface that, it's interesting because rehab and the proponents of rehab really gained ground by preaching organized skepticism. The idea that you admire those who seek truth, doubt those who claim they found it, and sort of the hallmark of any credible discipline is being able to take a step back and look and say, like, okay, here's where we've been, here's where we're going, here are some things where we might need to rein it in, right? Far as I can tell, that hasn't really happened within rehabilitation. There is almost sort of a dogmatic way of thinking when it comes to, what works versus what doesn't. In fact, there is the movement, what works to reduce recidivism. And, it should kind of be replaced with a question mark. You have what works with an exclamation mark, and it should be what works with a question mark. But if you talk to folks in rehab, or the rehab cartel, if you will, they will tell you definitively, like, we know what works to reduce recidivism. We have, high fidelity, evidence-based practices that are rooted in, risk, need, responsivity, the principles of effective intervention, all of these good things, cognitive behavioral therapy. These are the things that work to reduce recidivism. And any other modality, any other, punishment orientation is inhumane. It's ineffective. And I've literally heard folks refer to it as, punishments of meanness, right?
As a scientific term, of course.
Yes. Like we're moving towards, corrections of meanness, and so anything that kind of uproots that, you got to understand too that a lot of folks have, entrenched interests in this, right? There's a lot of money when it comes to these sorts of things in terms of well, even look here in Texas, we have the TRAS, right? The Texas Risk Assessment System. That came over from Ohio, right? The Ohio Risk Assessment System that was developed by, folks over at University of Cincinnati, UCCI. And this isn't to throw anybody under the bus in that respect. I love Cincinnati, but that kind of stuff really started the movement, right? You had folks who, really started to gain momentum in a variety of circles across the country. And just because, we'll come back to that analogy, the emperor is wearing no clothes doesn't mean that you can't still strut around naked, so to speak. You know what I mean? And so, one thing you need to know too is that a lot of folks, despite having sort of, an earnest desire to change the lives of offenders, they're also very heavily progressive and hate the idea of incarceration. They hate the idea of incapacitation as a modality, and they'll tell you as much.
And this is what you were talking about when you were saying that the Trojan horse that smuggles in other, say, nefarious ideologies.
I can remember back in 2020, I want to say that one of the things that the Biden administration ran on was reducing the prison population, the federal prison population, by 50%. And you heard sort of narrative after narrative about all of these different folks who don't deserve to be in prison, whose lives would be better served within the community. It actually echoed of the deinstitutionalization movement that, from my understanding, was a resounding policy success. But these folks were saying, well, a lot of folks don't deserve to be in prison. They're petty, low-level, offenders, right? Let's let them out, sort of thing. And, prisons are just bad, awful places associated with sort of sinister conservatives who want nothing more than to keep them down, so to speak. And that kind of thinking has really taken hold. And I would argue that it's co-opted a lot of the rehabilitation movement. These people can be rehabilitated in the community. And the problem is that when you're convinced of that, right, for ideological purposes, you start to overlook research that you might otherwise be critical of. Mm-hmm. You'll take anything as evidence, right?
You want your priors affirmed, and this affirms your priors.
And to be fair, all criminologists, all academics, all people have confirmation biases, mm-hmm. right? And, we have motivated reasoning. We have, standards that we hold ourselves to, or rather that we hold other people to. I might say, DC, you published this study and I don't like it, so I'm going to be hypercritical of it. I'm going to poke all different types of holes, and I'm going to say, you know what, I'm just being objective. But the research that I support could never measure up to that standard, right? And that happens on both sides. So it's not like we're just saying like politically this happens on one side. But with rehabilitation, right, especially now that you're seeing some of the evidence come out, I've spoken with colleagues and I've shown them, for example, some of these meta-analytic reviews and these systematic umbrella reviews that are sort of reevaluating the quality of these things. They say, nah, I still don't believe it. I know exactly what works. And you don't.
So the irony with this whole thing being with that specific dogmatic tendency that, and for the listeners, this isn't a crackpot conspiracy theory that you're coming up with. There really is a very deeply rooted dogma in the rehabilitative community. So much so, I just, the irony being that the reformers need a reformation, right? That's
well, it's what separates credible versus incredible disciplines.
You can go to Frank Collins' door and nail Martinson's theses to it.
I mean, the original title that we had for the paper was Reaffirming Robert Martinson, and he was sort of cast again as this villain, right? But he didn't really say anything that was controversial. In fact, he said something that I fundamentally believe when it comes to rehabilitation, is that some programs work some of the time. A lot of them aren't scalable, though.
Right. Well, I think that's a big takeaway point of this, is that folks might listen to this and think, oh, this is just another, this is just an anti-rehabilitationist, or this is somebody who, is dogmatic in his own thinking that we need to have punishment of meanness as determined by the Department of Vibes, I guess. But that being said, is you and I have talked. I've obviously been in your classes, interacted before as well. You're not anti-rehabilitation qua rehabilitation.
Far from it.
Yeah. In fact, I don't. And again, don't let me put words in your mouth. But I would say that you would love nothing more if we came up with this magic, this golden pill that we can give offenders, and they would just completely desist from crime. And so I think that the takeaway here, specifically in the discussion of policy implications, is less so throw everything out, just have them breaking rocks in the hot sun if they fight the law and the law wins. Instead of throwing that all out, maybe taking a skeptical, I don't want to say skeptical, but just a holistic, skepticism first view of rehabilitative practices is necessary so that we can actually separate the wheat from the chaff.
I think that is a good characterization of it. And I'll put words in my mouth and I'll say we should be skeptical. We should be skeptical of any discipline. You should admire those who seek truth and doubt those who claim they found it. And the truth of the rehabilitative crowd is that they found and know definitively what works. And I just don't think that's the case. And, again, not anti-rehabilitation in the slightest. I had a really good conversation with really famous criminologist Marcus Felsen about this a couple of years ago. And it was after some of the reviews started coming out. And he and I had this really nice conversation where he's like, irrespective of its effectiveness, from a moral point of view, we have to offer something to folks because some folks do change, right?
Fine.
So moralistically, there is an obligation there. I think where we really sort of need to, dial it back is with its scalability, with embracing it wholesale, with saying, again, that we know what works versus what doesn't. There's sort of this scholarly hubris that exists.
No.
Within academia writ large, believe it or not, right? And there's a humility that sort of needs to be returned to in terms of what we can, what we can't do. Life course criminology will tell you that the folks who wind up in prison are very, very, very difficult to change. These are deep-seated...
Kind of a definitional characteristic.
If you end up in prison, that's probably the most severe thing that our criminal justice system can throw at you. Add in the fact that the vast majority of folks who commit crime go through the system will never see the inside of a prison cell. The average sentence length is about 3.5 years, state level, right? And you need to look no further than a variety of sort of case studies that have come up over the past couple of years to see just how hard it is to spend any significant amount of time behind bars. In the paper, we use the case of Darrell Brooks, right? Who, and this would have been back in 2021, drove through the Christmas parade in Wisconsin, and he killed 6 people but injured 60 others. And the question then becomes like, how does this guy end up doing what he did? And you look at his rap sheet, and it spans over 20 years, and it's a bunch of different offenses. We're not just talking about violent, but a mix of violent, nonviolent, drug, right? And you look at how much time did this guy spend in prison? Not much. And usually his sentence was reduced at every stage. But we're talking about, he had sex offenses, drug offenses, assault, battery. In fact, before he ran over those people in the Christmas parade, he was awaiting trial for running over his son and his son's mother at a gas station. And so when we think about how hard it actually is to get into prison, again, there are some misnomers there, but these people have really, really troubled histories. And to think, for example, that we can just change their behaviors, right, is false. And it's almost baked into the way that we study rehab too. We look at follow-up periods, and some people might naturally push back, and I would give it to them, say, well, money matters, resources matter. But if you're only following somebody for a year, maximum of 3 years, my response to you would be give it time. Give it time and see what happens. The Bureau of Justice Statistics data tends to corroborate that. There are year-end statistics in 2022, for example, doing sort of a 10-year cohort study follow-up of folks, found that after about 5 years, north of 85% of them wind up back in prison, state prisons. That's like, you can't, with a straight face, say that rehabilitation has any sort of staying power. And then what folks will normally tell you is...
Rehabilitation writ large as applied in this case.
Yes. And I've talked to some really bright folks who would argue, well, we need the continuity of care. Okay, that once they re-enter society, we need to essentially follow them and track them and do sorts of things that, the more you get into it, starts to look a lot like the criminal justice system, starts to look like intensive supervision, right? And so the question becomes, like, this is a wicked social problem, by the way. It doesn't lend itself. So I'm not saying that we have these solutions waiting in the wings, because we don't.
But we're currently ensconced in a place where we will not find them should they exist.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. And you had mentioned also talking about sort of the the financial conflicts of interest, or maybe we had talked about that just a few moments ago, but I wanted to get to that because a lot of the folks, it's important for listeners to know that a lot of the folks who are evaluating the efficacy of these programs are also the ones who stand to benefit from it financially. A good analogy would be like if I was a cigarette company, if I was Marlboro, right, and I said, you know what, our cigarettes don't cause cancer. They don't have any appreciable effect on your lungs, for example. And I said, guess what? We're going to conduct a study, and we're going to do it, right? And guess what? We didn't find anything. No problems. Would you be a little skeptical?
Again, it's the fox's garden, the hen house. Even if it was somebody without a direct financial interest, again, it's somebody who, as you've demonstrated, has this overwhelming ideological prior with a foot in that camp, and perhaps doesn't even know the horse has blinders on at that point. So we're coming to the end of our time, so I wanted to make sure we hit this on the way out. Obviously, there was an election 3 weeks ago. There was obviously many storylines have emerged, but I think that one that I think we can all agree on was that there was a general repudiation of kind of far left or progressive ideals being foisted softly or hardly on just the normie voter. Mm-hmm. I think that is one way of reading that. Obviously, criminal justice is no different. That's also what separates some of the groups, some of the abolition groups, some of the let's just cut down all the sentences groups versus groups like us here with TPPF with Right on Crime, where it's like, no, the end goal always needs to be public safety. And if you get a policy that shows, obviously we need to have very stringent views on the research supporting it. But if there's a policy that, again, says this one golden pill will, result in X fewer victims, then by all means, let's pursue that, right? So that's the political and policy question where we're at now. So obviously the voters, and I don't think it was, monocausal by any means, mm-hmm. but I think we can categorize that the voters were. So, also look at the DAs who've been recalled or lost mm-hmm. in the elections. They're all to a T. I'm not going to enforce the law DAs. We're obviously in a moment right now where people want the punishment element. They want the accountability. When I say punishment, again, not meaning punishments of meanness, but they want the accountability. Somebody has wronged society and they need to answer for that. What would your framework be going? What would, Pam Bondi calls you in, says, Matt, you're such an eminent criminologist. What should we do at the federal and state level in order to actually deliver, criminal justice outcomes that people want?
I think just in terms of the mantra, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, though. I think you would want to reaffirm your commitment to public safety as opposed to, and this is just my personal opinion, I think for the past several decades, we've come to really romanticize the lives of offenders at the expense of public safety. Again, you let people out of prison, again, one of Biden's talking points in 2020 was to reduce the federal prison population by 50%. When folks go and get released from prison, they're not going to affluent, gated communities. Mm-hmm. They're usually going to crestfallen, downtrodden communities where crime is rampant and where disorder is a real problem, right? And the folks who are in those communities are sort of an afterthought. They generate the greatest calls for service, right? And, the past 10, 15 years, especially post-George Floyd, you had calls to get rid of those systems that would otherwise maybe be keeping people safe or at least providing some sort of vital service. A good medical analogy is that with hospitals, for example, right? Doctors have malpractice suits filed against them every year, right? And they're held accountable, right? You don't take the hospital away from the people who need the treatment. Mm-hmm. And there's a useful analogy there with defund and abolition and these types of things, because the people that you're taking those services away from are going to be invariably harmed. So in terms of policy, I would hope that just like forward-facing, you would say that we have a commitment to public safety. And I think you're starting to see that with at least some of the political messages that came across, this past election, with supporting police and supporting criminal justice personnel. I think that's a really, really important point. From my side, on the research side of things, and we make some recommendations from a research point of view that could certainly help guide policy, but there are financial conflicts of interest. The folks who are who have the risk assessments, who have the programming, like multisystemic therapy, makes a ton of money, and that's a certain treatment modality that is, they offer cognitive behavioral therapy and a variety of other things, but they make a ton of money, right? And again, they're the ones evaluating it. And the question is, okay, well, where do we go from here? Evaluation should be independent, right? So devoid of, if to the best that you can, financial conflicts of interest. They should have sufficient follow-up periods, right? Most of the studies in rehabilitation are, you're lucky if you get 3. It's completely at odds with the stability of antisocial behavior and what we know in that area. And then also sort of kind of as kind of putting our thumb on what we mean by recidivism. Are we talking about like being arrested within a very narrow time frame? Are we talking about going back to prison? Are we talking about technical violations? As a group of scholars, if we want to be seen as credible in the policy realm, we need to kind of hammer these things down. We need to have our own sort of coming to Christ moment where we can look each other in the eye and say, like, yeah, we are doing these things wrong, or these things need to be improved. And
at the very least, we need a common language.
Yeah, it's like you and I could be speaking 2 different things if we come from 2 different academic camps, right? And so that doesn't help any. Well, as a policymaker, why would I even bother to turn my neck towards the academic side of things when there's so much dissensus? And so we're not doing anybody any favors. And the other thing is we need to be realistic, okay, about what programs can and can't do. There's an iron law of program evaluation. It's the idea that when you do these initial evaluations, right, we tend to see the most pronounced effects. Follow-up periods almost always yield far more modest, if not insignificant effects. Most programs fail. That's another thing that people have to realize. And to the extent that they work, they're usually locally tailored. So you can't necessarily scale these things up. We point to, and I know we don't have time to talk about it, but we point to Washington State's juvenile justice programs and their adoptions and how that's sort of the penultimate case study of failure, right? This idea that we're going to adopt all these evidence-based practices, we're going to put them in, we're going to evaluate them, and what happens after 15, 20, 25 years of evaluation is you find that the effects not only dissipate, but they create far more iatrogenic situations than they do therapeutic. So therapeutic meaning good, iatrogenic meaning bad. But yeah, so from a policy point of view, I'm loath to make recommendations, and just because it's not my realm. But from an academic side of things, in terms of trying to inform folks who might be trying to pull those policy levers, those are the things that I would point to.
And I think that, and I really appreciate you being here and airing this critique of the emperor, as it were, because I think there's a lot of people that allow this to continue on autopilot because they didn't go to a top 3 criminology university. They didn't go to or spend 5 years reading these studies. They didn't spend back in our day when we had to take 2 comps, but they simply put it on autopilot and trust the experts. And I think that's something that we're starting to get to the end of. So anyway, Matt, you've been very generous with your time. Really glad that you were here. The paper coming out is called an unblinkered view on criminal rehabilitation, or at least that's the working title thus far. It's going to be put out by the Manhattan Institute. Obviously, do we have any idea on timeline on this?
I'm going to say within the next couple weeks to a month, but I don't want to be held to that.
We've all been in the editing process. I'm sure many scholars on my team will go ahead and complain about my turnaround times for their papers as well. But anyway, really appreciate you being here. Very important policy discussion. As always, go over to www.texaspolicy.com for all of the podcast, papers, research, and items that really move this state and provide that sound policy. So for Brian Phillips, who is not here, I want to say thank you for tuning in.